Kurt Volker is one of the leading American, not just diplomats, but also the minds within the transatlantic community. A man whom I had a privilege to meet on many occasions in the last more than 20 years. I remember that you were gaining your experiences working with such outstanding personalities like Dick Holbrooke when he was fixing the problems of the Balkans. I remember, and maybe that is the first moment when I have seen you when you worked for NATO Secretary General George Robertson, who was very popular here because of its active standing and support for the NATO enlargement, and being the guest at the NATO summit organized in Prague. Certainly, you know, we had a chance to cooperate very much when you were the US ambassador to NATO. That was during our effort to bring the components of the US ballistic missile defense system into Prague, and we did not succeed, but you were very helpful in crafting that. So thank you very much for all your support, because you worked mostly for the Republican presidents. Then you had also your interesting time outside of the government, establishing and founding the John McCain Center for International Leadership. You worked also for John McCain in the past, and that was really a man of the heroic status here. So we really liked his attitude and active stand in the US foreign policy arena. And last but not least, then you were also responsible for the relations to the Ukraine. So after the Crimea disaster, so all your work in the last 2 decades has been marked with an attempt to help NATO to fix the key problems and challenges in the Eastern Theater, and therefore you deserved a lot of Czech thanks. The first question is always 9/11. What did you do? Where you have been? And what was your first reaction?
I appreciate everything that you just said, and I want to add a couple names to that as well. One person I worked with who you knew very well, who we now remember with great reverence, is Ron Asmus. And Ron was, I would say, a young guy, younger by far than we are now, who was really the intellectual architect of a Europe whole and free. George H.W. Bush had the rhetoric, but Ron Asmus had the how-to. He knew what to do to really bring Europe together. And, you know, we definitely remember him. Also, Ron and you and I also worked very closely with Dan Fried over many years. I was Dan's deputy in government for about 7 years. And I don't think we would have gotten where we are with NATO membership for the Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary, or later for the Prague Summit enlargement without Dan. And that was something that I worked on, and one of my visits to Prague was for the Prague Summit. And that was 2002, November, and I was working as the director for NATO issues at the National Security Council. But because it was a summit, being director for NATO at the National Security Council was not high enough level to be in the room. We had the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and so I was outside the room. So I snuck into the interpreter's booth and watched the summit take place next to the interpreters, so I could see, you know, what I had worked so hard on for so long really materialize. And it was a great experience being here in Prague for that. On September 11th, 2001, I was working in the National Security Council. I had just started, I'd been there probably 2-3 weeks. Dan Fried was the senior director for Europe. I was the director for NATO issues. We had a staff meeting that was scheduled to take place at, I believe, 8:30. And typically we were all there around 8:15. And I remember watching on a television screen outside Dan's office, seeing the first plane hit the first tower of the World Trade Center. And it was shocking and horrible, and we thought, what a tragedy, what actually happened, we don't know. And we went in to do our staff meeting, and typically these are 10 to 15 minutes. We just coordinate, what do we need to do? Come out of the staff meeting, and I'm looking at the television to find out what happened, and we see the second plane hit the tower. And I immediately thought, this is terrible. What's going on? How do we even process what this is? It didn't register what it really meant. And I went back to my desk and I started to log onto the computer and get ready to work for the day. And then we get an emergency message to evacuate the building. And having just watched 2 airplanes hit the 2 towers of the World Trade Center on television, and then someone's telling you to evacuate the White House, you have a feeling that you better evacuate the White House. And so we very, very quickly just locked everything up, went down the stairs, and said, we just got to get away from this building. But to illustrate how I still didn't understand what was going on, I had just moved to Washington, D.C. I hadn't done any of the usual things you do when you move. So I thought, okay, if I can't work at the White House today, I'll go over to the Department of Motor Vehicles and get my car registered because I still have to do that. And I literally got on the metro, went over there, got there, and saw that they had shut down and abandoned as well. And that's the first time it dawned on me that this is actually something really big. This is bigger than all of us, bigger than we can imagine.
When did you recognize that this is an attack? And then when did you get some first information who is behind?
When you saw the second plane hit, then you knew it was an attack. So this is not a coincidence. You can't do that by coincidence. Definitely attack. But I didn't understand the significance of it. So, okay, there's a terrorist attack. That happens. We've had hijackings, we've had car bombings, whatever. So I didn't quite get that. And then in terms of where it came from, it was only the next day when what had been in the private government discussions about al-Qaeda and intelligence and security threats where people knew al-Qaeda, I had vaguely heard of it. I vaguely remembered the Clinton administration I think it was a cruise missile attack against a base in Afghanistan. So, okay, I knew something about that. But I didn't really understand that it was a coordinated cell, or network in Afghanistan that had a cell in Hamburg that directed this attack. And once you understood that, then you saw, okay, this is now a bigger problem. And even then, I still did not come to the conclusion that, therefore, let's invade Afghanistan. That was not an immediate conclusion that I drew. But when you then started getting deeper into the information that the Taliban had created a place where al-Qaeda was able to train tens of thousands of people, and then to create the planning to be able to carry out an attack like that, and there was nothing to stop them from doing it again, that's when you realize, okay, there's a bigger problem here. So that might have taken a couple weeks.
Now let's move a little bit further in the time. Afghanistan. It was, we have the knowledge about Taliban hosting Al-Qaeda, and it was pretty clear that this is the first really serious response outside of the United States. From Europe, there were the strong voices of solidarity. We are all Americans. NATO was offering its helping hand. You decided to act separately and invite NATO later. Was it a serious debate inside the administration whether to go for NATO first or not? what is there a consensus that this is something where the United States cannot wait for Luxembourg consent and act immediately? Do you remember the debate?
I do remember that because I was one of the people arguing that this should be NATO. Because as you remember, on September 12th, NATO invoked Article 5. It was a pure show of solidarity with the United States. And we were then moving to do the initial invasion into Afghanistan. And I literally argued within the National Security Council staff and tried to get a few other people higher level to make the same arguments that I don't care if we just ask them to do logistics or, do air traffic control or do something, but give every member of NATO something to do so that we all do it together, that this was the important thing. And unfortunately, our decision-making was the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of Defense. They were the key deciders. How are we going to execute an invasion of Afghanistan and wipe out al-Qaeda? And they had no interest in complicating it. They wanted to use whatever the United States had at its disposal to do it the way we wanted to do it. I should add CIA director as well, too. So the argument that NATO should be in there, to them, had no utility. And I think it's something that we saw a couple times in the Bush administration, to underestimate the political value of working together because we were focused solely on the operational value.
Did they prefer the military point of view? Because where was the military? Where were the armed forces in that kind of a debate?
The armed forces wanted to go in big. We had the Powell Doctrine and we had the experience of Bosnia and Kosovo, that whatever we wanted the U.S. military to do, they wanted to go do with saturation of military capacity. And the CIA and the President and Rumsfeld did not want that. They wanted to be smart, targeted, light, and so they developed the first armed drones to be able to send things ahead and take things out. They did targeting of things on the ground that you could bring in airstrikes to do, so you didn't have to have a heavy ground presence. And then we worked with the Northern Alliance to let them soften up the battlefield before we got there. So they came up with a way to do an invasion light, and it turned out, because they had never had to fight for themselves before, the Taliban toppled very quickly. So it seemed that that was a sensible strategy. But then we confronted the problem the other way around. Now that we have taken over Afghanistan, how do you hold it and keep it secure? And then we needed more and more people on the ground. And that's finally when we got the Pentagon, Rumsfeld, around to saying, okay, now we can bring in NATO so they can, take over pieces of Afghanistani territory.
The hunting of Osama took more than 10 years. Did you expect it would take such a long time? And can you tell us something, whether, there was some moment when you were really almost certain that you have it and then he escaped?
Yeah. So I was not involved in that part of things. In the early days, we thought we would get him in Afghanistan still. There was this battle at Tora Bora. We thought he was there. We thought that would be successful. And it all evaporated. And then he had incredibly good operational security, so we were not able to use electronics to track him down so easily. And it should not have surprised us that he was living in Abbottabad next to the Pakistani military headquarters. And if we had actually been honest with ourselves and started looking there, we might have found him a lot earlier.
Without Pakistani support, would he be able to hide for such a long time?
Yes, I think it was something that could not have happened without Pakistan, and that we should have anticipated would have to have been the case. I think we were relying on signals and intelligence and electronics and not using our brains.
If I'm not mistaken, 20 years after, there is a chance that the archives will make public some more details, will publish some materials. So it's coming soon. Do you expect some serious information or just a minor specification? So what are you expecting?
Well, the one thing that would be, I'd say, revelatory, if it is in this information, we don't know if it is yet or not, would be if the Saudi government knew about this or was involved in this and didn't stop it or didn't tell us that. If the Saudi Arabian government knew this, that would be shocking to people and I think would have even a current day impact.
Is it possible that we would hear something? Would the administration allow to do that?
I'd say if this were 15 or 20 years ago, it would probably not be possible to hear that because even if it were in there, people would want to preserve the relationship and the common strategy with Saudi Arabia. I'd say today's different. If it is true, if it's a fact, if we have evidence of that, I don't think that the mitigating factors are there as much. I think that the human rights situation, the decreasing reliance on Middle East oil, the lack of interest in foreign policy generally, I'd say the mitigating factors are not there.
Interesting. Iraq. There are two schools of thought. One is that you were planning Iraqi operation even before 9/11. I remember when I was coming back from Washington, D.C. as the ambassador, it was early August 2001, so 1 month before 9/11, we had some vacations in Tuscany, and there was a debate about Iraq, that it's an unfinished job. But on the other hand, of course, you know, to start something big like this, you need the political justification at home. So without 9/11, do you believe that you would start Iraqi war or would not be possible?
Yeah. My personal view is no. I think that even though, as you say, there were people in the administration who viewed it as unfinished business and who wanted to go into Iraq and remove Saddam Hussein, I don't think that argument would have won without 9/11. Couple of reasons. One of them, if you remember President Bush before 9/11, he was not a foreign policy president. And he said, we don't want to do nation building abroad. And he was focused on domestic economy. And he had the memory of his father not getting reelected because he was too focused on foreign policy and seemed to be out of touch with where people were in the United States. So I don't think we would have done that. I don't think the president would have approved that. But then after 9/11, not only was it a wake-up call that foreign policy can hit us hard and it's threatening and we need to know what we're doing in the world, it also was connected to the idea that if terrorists who hit us on 9/11 had access to WMD materials, even if it's just radioactive materials, but what if it's a nuclear weapon or what if it's a chemical weapon, it would have been 10 times more devastating. And the belief was grounded in intelligence at the time that Saddam Hussein was seeking weapons of mass destruction, and that he wouldn't hesitate to give them to terrorists. As we know now, that intelligence was wrong, and the reason it was wrong is because Saddam Hussein was deliberately feeding that information in order to make himself appear stronger than he really was. But we didn't know that at the time, and so people thought this is a serious risk. And we then had the combination of wake-up call, foreign policy, national security, WMD, and terrorists, I think, created the toxic brew that was needed to say, okay, let's go into Iraq. And whether or not you would agree with that judgment, I think in hindsight, we can say that it took our eyes off the ball of what we were trying to do.
Now let's move to the current times and, 20 years after. So what we have achieved, where we have failed. So let's first concentrate on NATO, because I think that we have to avoid mixing NATO with Afghanistan. There are two different stories and two different, in fact, issues. There were some military goals, there were some political goals. First of all, NATO, 20 years after 9/11, so what we have achieved and when we have failed?
Well, there's a lot in that. So after 9/11, by a year and 2 months, was the Prague Summit. And NATO enlargement to the 3 Central European countries first, and then to the Magnificent Seven after, that is NATO guaranteeing security so that you have 100 million people in Europe who now live in democracies, in free market societies, and don't have to worry about their grandchildren's future, which was not true before this. And this happened partly 97, the Madrid summit for Czech Republic, Poland, and Hungary, but partly the big expansion that took place after was because after 9/11 we realized that we want allies. It's a big deal. So it helped with NATO enlargement. Second thing is NATO in terms of Article 5, the idea of collective self-defense is as strong as ever. I don't think there's any damage whatsoever to the perception in NATO that if there is an attack against a NATO member, we all will deal with it. When President Trump, tried to draw a question mark over this to see if he could pressure countries to spend more on defense, he got a very solid pushback on this domestically as well as from European allies. Saying, you don't question this. You have to do that. So I think the Article 5 piece is still very solid. NATO as an expeditionary security provider, like we did in Bosnia or Kosovo, and then later in Afghanistan, I think that is severely damaged by the way we got out of Afghanistan. I think that allies feel that we didn't consult enough, we changed the mission abruptly, we left behind a mess, we spent thousands of lives, billions and trillions of dollars, and for what? So next time, very reluctant to get together on something like that. And then finally, political solidarity, political consultations at NATO. Again, after something like this, it's going to be very hard to establish a consensus to do anything because there'll be a very high degree of skepticism that the U.S. will be consistent and follow through.
Afghanistan, 20 years after, of course, everybody has the picture of this escape, that was a fiasco, you cannot advocate it. But, to look this in a more nuanced and reflective way, in general, where you see the success and where you see the failure. I'll
try to be optimistic first, which is we were in Afghanistan for 20 years. That's a generation. And a lot of Afghans had exposure to education, especially women, hundreds of thousands of women educated, university. Girls got an opportunity to go to school. Business and economy developed significantly. There were opportunities for travel. There was international engagement and support. People have a lot of contact outside Afghanistan that was not the case before 2001. So I think society in Afghanistan has to have been affected by this, even if we've let them down and the Taliban has taken over physically. I think that in the minds of people, it's not the same country as it was 20 years ago. So that's my optimistic scenario. I'd say also a piece of optimism. We have so many people in our countries, Czech Republic, UK, US, who now have exposure to Afghanistan. We've had soldiers who served there, we've had aid workers who've been there, diplomats who've been there, media. This is no longer an unknown corner of the earth. This is a place that people have some understanding of. And I think that also is beneficial because they're going to need that engagement in the future. But then to the pessimistic side, which I think is dominant right now. When we went into Afghanistan in 2001, the Taliban was a weak, disorganized force. Al-Qaeda had training camps there, and they managed to pull off a spectacular terrorist attack. As we leave, the Taliban is back in power. Al-Qaeda stretches from the Sahel to East Asia, including the Middle East and South Asia. The Taliban now has the best armaments that American military dollars can buy, helicopters to M16s to whatever. It has become ISIS has grown up in the shadow of Al-Qaeda, which is even more lethal in their ideology than Al-Qaeda is. So we have created a stronger terrorist threat than we started with in 2001. And Afghanistan is going right back into a dark ages state based on the Taliban's ideology, which is going to then create tremendous suffering for people. We now have a population, as I said, that may have a more enlightened mentality, which will feel the darkness even more than the population would have in the 1990s.
I think a key question from my perspective, there is an agreement, I think, among everybody that NATO should now focus more on the traditional mission of the self-defense, Article 5 as a core. It's undoubtedly true, that's our key interest in Europe. But also our key interest in Europe is to keep the US committed to NATO Article 5, because without the US, there would not be any NATO. And the last 20, 25 years, those out-of-area missions were a certain justification for, let's say, the new transatlantic bargain. United States will continue to be committed for defending Europe, Article 5, and in exchange, us, Europeans, will be ready to raise our flags in those various out-of-area operations to help the United States to fill their mission to guard the global stability, peace, free flow of goods, etc. So now, in the world without those missions, what should be the new transatlantic burden to guarantee that you would continue to be committed for the European defense according to Article 5? So what we should do to keep you interested in?
I think it's going to take a long time before we get back to this idea of a transatlantic bargain like you described. I don't think Europe is going to be prepared to commit to expeditionary things far away. And I think they're going to question American judgment in some of this, such as before what just happened in Afghanistan, we talked about a new NATO strategic concept where we would talk about broader geography, like we should be consulting about China, we should be consulting about Iran. And we should be having a wider array of threats than just military, like cyber and disinformation. I think there's going to be a high degree of skepticism in Europe about American leadership on that. I think there'll be a perception of America being a bit hypocritical, that, we say you Europeans have to cut off China, but are you cutting off Apple from China? No, you're not. So which is it? And so I think that's going to be very difficult. In terms of American commitment to Article 5, I think it's also going to have to be pushing the United States to recognize that, yes, China is a great long-term threat, but before you get to the long term, you have the short term. And in the short term, Russia is a real threat. And they will be also drawing lessons from what they've seen in Afghanistan and what they've been able to get away with in Georgia or Ukraine. And I think that we need to both, as we look ahead to a new NATO strategic concept, so again, a year out from now, we actually need to shift the focus back onto Article 5, saying this is the heart of NATO. This is the one thing that we actually all agree on. We can't take it for granted, and we can't dilute it by things elsewhere. We have to actually reinforce this. And then the second thing I would say is important is we need to get ourselves focused back on those countries that have not yet made it. There are, I mentioned 100 million people who did make it. There's another, what's the number, 70 million that have not made it. And they are preyed upon by Russia. Russia looks at them as part of its sphere of influence. It doesn't recognize the legitimacy of their independence. It has taken territory from these countries, and I don't think NATO has ever taken this seriously. And from the Bucharest summit, we set out this 2008, this grand vision. Oh yes, Georgia, Ukraine, they can eventually become members of NATO, but we've had no serious movement on this since then. And meanwhile, these are real people in real places who are feeling more and more pressure on their independence and sovereignty. And I think NATO has to start taking this seriously.
Before I would ask you to raise your question, maybe the last one on my side. Everybody was talking about those iconic pictures with the exit from Afghanistan. I would put another one to that. That was 2 months before the exit. There was a rainbow flag flying over your embassy in Kabul, like a message that what are you expecting Taliban do once you depart. And I think it tells something about the US promoting the various ideals across the world, expecting not just countries like Afghanistan, but even Russia or whatever, would follow your social culture revolution, something, what you have achieved after 100 years discussion, so that those countries would do it overnight. It's totally nonsense. And it's just generate a smile at the best among, Putin or Xi Jinping or others' minds. And my question, can this fiasco help, to wake up the United States at home, because, we need America strong, not the society which is, fragmented according to tribal or identity lines. Can you tell us something, I don't want any detail, but you will certainly draw some lessons out of this, as the America, contrary to Europe, is able to have a major debate, a reflective debate. This is something what Europe is almost impossible, what I know. Yes, a European Commission time to time announced a reflection debate about future of Europe, but it generates always the same and without any impact. But you are a different. I have a huge trust in ability of the American society to overcome the various, challenges, problems, crises. So, do you draw the lessons out of this, or it's too soon, and we will continue to have a feeling that this is not the America which we remember?
Well, that's a pretty hard question to answer.
In particular, if it is state,
the State Department today put out a statement expressing shock and unhappiness that there are no women in the new cabinet that was named by the Taliban. It makes you wonder what they were thinking. Did they expect there to be women in the Taliban cabinet? Domestically in the US, we're having roiling political, societal debates over systemic racism? Is the fact that there are disproportionate results affecting minorities evidence of systemic racism, or is it performance-based? Do you create a level playing field, a fair system, and then people compete, or is in fact the level playing field is inherently unfair because it's level? And so we're having these debates internally. And things that we 20 years ago would have taken for granted, that there's equal rights, that everyone has right to compete, there should be equal protection for everybody. These are now turned upside down as, no, that's not sufficient. We have systemic racism, we need corrective action, and if you're not in favor of corrective actions, you're in favor of an unfair system. So we're just going through all of this. And I take this back to your question about the rainbow flag. I would take the point of view that, look, everybody's human rights deserve to be respected. Male, female, children, old, gay, whatever. Doesn't matter. We need to respect human rights. That's a fundamental thing. What the U.S. has increasingly done is focus on the far edge of human rights. We take for granted that, oh, you just don't go kill your political opponent, or, oh, you don't go, beat your wife, or, oh, you don't go, torture, your neighbor in your basement because they have a different religion. We take all that for granted. When that shouldn't be taken for granted, we should put out all human rights should be respected. Because the moment we go for that far edge of the LGBTQ plus rights or whatever it might be, we are not in tune with societal values in many other places of the world. And that doesn't mean they're right and we're wrong. It doesn't mean that we're right and they're wrong. It means that we're not going to be talking about the same things and understanding the same things. And we need to be doing that if we actually want to deal with the big challenges in the world. An illustration on the rainbow agenda that you mentioned is, I'm thinking about the Georgian Orthodox Church or the Russian Orthodox Church. They take Western proactive pushing of LGBTQ rights with glee because they can turn that back to their religious followers and say, see how decadent the West is, see how corrupt they are. That's why you can't trust them and you have to stay with us, this Orthodox Church, which in turn is instrumentalized by Putin to create authoritarianism and an empire mindset. And so that's the danger that we fall into by pushing out our liberalism into places that where the societies are not there.
So now we are out of Afghanistan. So hopefully there are not going to be any attacks from Afghanistan. So the Afghanistan is going to be a mess, like there are many other places in the greater Middle East where we will hopefully not have to return in next decade or two. The question mark is, what are we going to do and what the US is going to do with those hands not tied into that theater of war in Afghanistan? Because there are three other places which are much more crucial and where the future is going to be judged. South China Sea and Taiwan, Ukraine, and Iran, or Iranian nuclear program specifically, not more of that. So the question mark is, if we can expect that there is going to be more focus now with those hands untied from Afghanistan, more focus on those theaters in Washington, or if the retreat from Afghanistan means also retreat from those other theaters.
I think it boils down to the willingness of the U.S., and it's not just this administration, it's future administrations as well, the willingness of the U.S. to exercise power. Because we are saying one thing. We're saying, oh yeah, we're getting out of Afghanistan, but that's in order to be able to focus on things like China and whatever, so don't worry about it. But the actions say something else. The actions say we don't have the will to accomplish a mission, we don't have the stamina, and we're not willing to use force. And so if China looks at that and they say, well, I hear what you're saying, but I frankly don't believe you, and they'll test us, as you said, it really will come down to whether the administration has the determination to use power, to exercise power in order to achieve a goal, to promote an agenda, to defend a red line. We've seen so many red lines crossed over the last many years. I don't think we have the credibility of just the words. We have to actually have the will to act, and I don't think people see it right now, and our success or failure will depend upon our will to act.
I would like to ask you what do you think about the renewed calls for European autonomy and sovereignty, or whatever you call it.
Good crisis is an opportunity for people to call for doing what they wanted to do anyway. So Macron comes out and calls for more autonomous Europe. EU comes out and calls for more EU. President Zeman comes out and calls for decreasing defense spending. And I bet he won't be alone. I bet there'll be a lot of countries that will come out, oh, well, now we don't need to spend money on defense. Germany will probably do that as a result. So everyone's just going to use it to call for what they want to call for. Regarding more European autonomy, I've seen this so many times. I've never seen Europe actually willing to do it. And it is, in fact, the major member states that prevent it. They don't want to do it. It is a rhetoric to talk about, we're pro-Europe, but when it comes to actually creating capabilities to be under European control and to be paid for and provided by the European member states, there's no interest in doing it, and I don't think it's going to happen this time either. And it would be good. It would be in the U.S. interest for Europeans to provide more resources into defense and security and organize them however they want. Doesn't matter. But we don't see it. It just doesn't happen. And so I don't think it's going to happen this time either. I actually think that it'll be used as an excuse to not spend more money on defense and to focus more inwardly on internal issues at a state level, let alone a European level.
The first question is, what's the likelihood or probability now that either China or Russia or both would think that they now have a window of opportunity to attack Taiwan and or Ukraine, respectively? What's the probability now that they think in that way? And the second question, had you been an advisor to President Biden, what would have you recommended him? What one deed or step should President Biden do now in order to restore the confidence of allies in his administration and to disappoint the enemies of America and their belief that they now have a window of opportunity?
Well, they're actually, I think, related questions. Concerning China and Taiwan, I think the Chinese will take the lesson from the Taliban that time is on their side, that the U.S. will not sustain this for the long haul, and they will keep up the pressure incrementally. I don't think China will launch an all-out attack to try to take over Taiwan, but they will gradually try to create such an overwhelming presence that Taiwan's options are incredibly limited, and they'll try to get a reabsorption of Taiwan through that with little American resistance by the time that happens. So they're going to play for time. Putin, on the other hand, I don't think thinks that way. I think he thinks in terms of strength and weakness, and he sees weakness now. And I can think of any number of things that he would do to both move his chess pieces a little bit further forward and also gauge from our reaction to that what his next moves could be. And so we just saw news today that he put Russian fighter aircraft to patrol the Belarusian-Polish border. And as a result of Zapad 21, I think it's quite conceivable that he would take over control of the borders of Belarus. That would be particularly alarming for Ukraine to have Russian forces to the north as well as to the east. And that could happen without an announcement and without any kind of fighting, and just, now here's a new fact. And how does the US and how does Europe respond to that? You could see an escalation in fighting in the Donbass. You could see an effort to take the water canal that used to provide water to Crimea. You could see pressure, trying to close off the Sea of Azov, or more closures in the Black Sea. Any number of things. Recognition of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics as independent states. And he'd gauge from that, well, what is our reaction going to be? And if it's not very convincing, he'll do it, and then he'll look for the next thing. So I think that's more worrying, in fact, than the immediate thing with China. And in terms of what you would advise President Biden to do, it's too late to go back and advise him not to do what he just did. It's done. But going forward, I think he has to do something where he is using the U.S. military to accomplish a goal. I think that there is a perception that he is not willing to do that. The last 2 weeks have all been public statements about how effectively we handled an evacuation. We evacuated more people in the last 2 weeks than ever have been evacuated anywhere in all humanity. That is true. But that is not something that's going to make people stand up and be concerned about, well, what might the U.S. do? This is like, how quickly can the U.S. get out? And I think to establish a goal, create a strategy, and defend that goal effectively, to include the use of the U.S. military in some way, I think would just be a necessary thing to stabilize perceptions that we are not retreating globally, we're choosing where to be.
I have two questions. First is actually about the US defense budget. It's not much discussed, but if you look at the facts, it was over 6% GDP during the Cold War. It dropped to 3%, which is well above the 2%. But for US interests, question is it enough? Is there actually a will of Biden's administration to increase the defense budget? Second question, you already touched on that issue. It has the Ukraine. Putin, a month ago, publicized the article saying Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians are actually one nation, and we will defend that nation. I think this is qualitatively new element in the game, and he's up to something qualitatively new, maybe splitting strategically the Ukraine into two big pieces, or maybe trying to. So what do you think he could be up to, actually?
Yeah. Well, first off, on the defense budget, I see kind of a flat lining for now. The administration will not want to increase the defense budget, and maybe even look for some savings as we are getting out of Afghanistan, and to divert resources to things like settling refugees. But the Congress will not want to see the defense budget go down. They're very concerned about weakening capabilities, and they'll point to China as the main reason why we need to keep our defense capabilities up. So the tension between the two, the Congress and the administration, will probably keep it about level. Concerning Putin's his quasi-historical, pseudo-historical manifesto, I think we should be taking it seriously, for one. It's a distorted historical argument on purpose. So what's the purpose? And second, I think it's probably got more to do with justification of absorption of Belarus in de facto terms than it does with Ukraine in the immediate term. But it also is an indicator that he's going to keep up the war in Ukraine. Putin, we were just in Tallinn at the Leonard Meri conference, and there were some Russian speakers there who laid it out pretty clearly, that there is a perception that the countries that were part of the former Soviet Union are not legitimate countries, They they are, what was the phrase that was used? That they don't have their own agency, that Russia gets to decide what they should be. If they persist in an anti-Russian narrative, then of course, we'll take their territory, we'll, wage war against them, and we cannot allow them to be closer to Europe and the West and NATO. So a very deliberate Russian policy to keep them down. And I think Putin is very serious about that. That's what he intends to do. It's why he has taken, the Czech Republic was one of the founders of the Eastern Partnership within the European Union 12 years ago. And since then, Russia has put troops on the territory of every single Eastern Partnership country in one form or another. And this is a very deliberate act by Russia to prevent these countries from achieving a relationship with Europe. And here, I think this is something the EU should be talking about. So maybe during the Czech presidency next year, this becomes a topic. And I think it's something the US and the EU should talk about together, because we should not be accepting that these countries are somehow lesser people and lesser countries than everybody else in Europe.
Speaking about 9/11, I would like to ask you this opportunity and ask you for a short comment about, from my point of view, quite interesting Russian behavior, because if I remember well, Vladimir Putin, he was one of the first and maybe first who expressed full support to US president, and I think that Mr. Bush reaction was quite emotional and changed for quite a long time pragmatical US policy towards Russia. So how did you read it?
Well, we had arguments about this even during the first term of the Bush administration, because there were some of us who believed that Putin was going to be an aggressor and was rebuilding an authoritarian system, and we shouldn't be soft-pedaling that problem with Russia. We should be pushing back on it, not accepting it. But there are others who argued that no, we need to play for the long term. We should work with Russia where we can. We should be reassuring where we can, because we don't want to escalate into a new Cold War with Russia. So that was the argument. And so even during the first term of the Bush administration, we tried to maintain this idea of a strategic partnership with Russia. And you may have seen, I wrote something a few months ago, this is something every administration has done. And when will we finally learn that Putin takes advantage of this deliberate determination to de-escalate and to avoid confrontation with Russia in order to accelerate confrontation, so that he can take out more and more positions and know that we will be looking for off-ramps, to coin another phrase. And by taking advantage of our willingness to say, okay, we'll disagree in some areas but work together in others, he uses this very adeptly. I don't believe that Vladimir Putin really cares about climate change, but if John Kerry does, then he'll dangle cooperation on climate change to make sure that we don't push too hard against Russia on things like Ukraine or Georgia. So he's very adept at using these non-linkages, and we should be doing the opposite. We should be putting up a solid front. We've seen it in every administration. President Bush, President Obama with the reset, President Trump, now President Biden with the summit in June, and so on. I think we need to recognize that Putin actually means what he says. That he wants to see the destruction of NATO. He doesn't believe in the sovereignty of his neighboring countries, and he is going to continue to push on all of these issues. And if I can come back to one point that I was making earlier about the countries that have not made it, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova in particular, we in Europe and the United States need to be making clear to Putin the fact that there are Russian troops occupying the territory of these countries is not in itself a reason why they could not be part of the EU or NATO. We can live with that if they can live with that and still become part of the EU and NATO. If it's about NATO, we just say that we have a mutual agreement of no retaking territory by force. we support only the peaceful reincorporation of these territories, but not taking it by force. Because if we don't say that, it creates an incentive for Putin to continue to occupy territory, and it permanently keeps these countries away from achieving their aspirations, which we should not accept.
Why we shouldn't stay there, at least in part of Afghanistan. If we have two Koreas, why we don't have two Afghanistans? Part of Afghanistan, which would be quite a sort of protectorate, where the Afghan people who don't like Taliban could move and they don't need to escape to Europe. We could build functionable states. It would be probably very costly, quite risky, but still better than to leave it totally. That's the first question. And the second, which came to my mind when Daniel Kostoval mentioned the budget issue. For what United States are going to have such a huge budget for defense and military, more than 3%, if President Biden said that, well, there is a new era now. United States would not interfere and you will not go to the operations like you left in Afghanistan. So why you should keep such a huge budget?
I think on the defense budget, you're going to see that this is all justified in terms of China. That we need to have a navy and an offshore capacity, an air capacity, a space capacity to be able to compete effectively with China, and those are all big ticket items. And you won't see a justification based on the ability to intervene in anything in Europe. I think it's not even being discussed in the administration seriously. And to the extent there's a European crisis, there will be this attitude that, well, Europe should deal with that. Why isn't Europe dealing with that? So I think we will have a high level, but it's going to be oriented towards Asia just as a political matter, not even towards the Middle East and terrorism. I think that there's a desire to reduce our presence in Iraq and Syria and elsewhere rather than increasing that. Concerning a divided Afghanistan, I agree with you. I think it's amazing to me that options like that were not considered seriously anyway. The first thing would have been to do nothing. First thing would have been to say, the Taliban is not living up to the agreement that it reached with the Trump administration, so we don't feel bound by it, and we will not be pulling out on this schedule, and we expect the Taliban to live up to its word. Further reaching would be simply to say, we don't agree with the Trump administration, there will be no deadline. But if the Biden administration didn't want to do that, at least they could hold out for conditions-based withdrawal. Then if you are still determined to withdraw, you can say, well, how? You didn't have to do it this way of just pulling out as quickly as possible by an arbitrary deadline while the country collapses. Even as you could see, as we start to pull out, major provincial cities are falling, you could stop and say, wait a second, this is not the way we intended this to go. I think your suggestion of a north-south or a northeast-southwest Afghanistan, whatever it might be, worth looking at. Who knows? But I think we started off with an assumption we're just going to pull out and it'll be okay without listening to facts, testing the assumption, being nimble and adapting along the way. I think it was just driven from the top that way. Really very sad. And I think it is, frankly, the only way we could reverse this now is a major new invasion, which clearly they're not going to do. So I think that's now off the table for a while, and we're now dealing with the issues of cleanup.
It seems to me that one period is over. Are we back in the same old business? Is the nature of the military power still the same, or does technology make a difference? Are we still dealing with the same things like strategic triad and, as a basis of a strategic balance, or does technology matter? And we hear people saying, armory matters. Look at Donbass. We need good old artillery and things like that. Technology is just, few things. But there are other people who say, no, I mean, maybe there is a change in that. So would you briefly comment on that? Because I think maybe it's time to think about this.
So at some fundamental level, the nature of war or conflict is the same as ever. You win or you lose. And the idea of winning means that you've accomplished your goals. How you win is now much more complicated because I do think that the nature of this has changed a lot. I think cyber and cyber attacks and preventing cyber attacks and command and control over systems, this is more important than ever before, incredibly complicated, and I think there will be a contest for who can more effectively engage in cyber attacks and cyber defense. So that's one very big one. Second is the remote ability to attack, what we call over the horizon now, the cruise missiles, the guided, conventional cruise missiles, the drone attacks, manned drones, unmanned drones, autonomous drones that make their own targeting decisions. All of that is going off in that direction as well. So the technological side is incredibly important. That being said, you will never win with that alone because you still need to then take and hold territory, and you need people to accept an outcome. And that won't happen simply by technology. It's going to happen with people on the ground. But how you get to the point of having the people on the ground to win, that's changed fundamentally.
Maybe the US are in some crisis, but Volker is in a full form, so that's a positive. Thank you for coming. We have needed this kind of at least bright mind approach and a lot of explanations. So that's exactly what we are looking for. So thank you very much, and I hope you see you again here at Severo.
Thank you so much, Sasha. It is an honor to be here with you and all of you, and a pleasure to be back in the Czech Republic. And we just have to keep connecting the dots between what we are as a people and a civilization. We care about values and people, and how we build a world in which that is stronger and reflected. And there's no other way, there's no better way, so we just have to keep at it.